What would you do if someone ordered you to survive 3 weeks in snow without tents, without firewood, and without proper supplies? Most men would call it took their own life. But for soldiers in World War II, there was no choice. They were thrown into frozen forests, battered by rain that cut through uniforms, and trapped in mud that swallowed boots whole. There was no waiting for comfort, no luxury of retreat. If they didn't build shelter from nothing, they simply would not endure. So they turned the impossible into routine. A trench, roofed with scavenged timber, became a refuge against blizzards. A poncho, tied between rifles, held back the relentless rain. A wall of branches and mud turned into insulation strong enough to keep frost from taking hold. These weren't experiments. These were solutions forged under fire, tested in the harshest winters in generations. And every hack carried one truth: survival meant adaptation, not strength alone. Today, most of us have forgotten them. Yet the wisdom remains. Simple methods that held back snow, defied rain, and resisted mud can still work anywhere, even now. So ask yourself, if the storm came tomorrow and all you had was earth, canvas, and willpower, would you know what to build? Subscribe now and step into the hidden survival genius of World War II soldiers. Number 1. Trench covers with corrugated iron and logs. For soldiers in World War II, the trench was both a shield and a prison. It kept them low from enemy fire, but it also exposed them to a new enemy: the sky. Snow fell until trenches filled waist deep. Rain poured until the bottom turned into drowning mud. Without cover, the very place meant to save lives became unlivable. The solution came not from supply lines, but from salvage. Soldiers scavenged corrugated iron sheets from bombed rail yards, collapsed warehouses, or wrecked barns. Where no metal could be found, heavy logs cut from nearby woods filled the gap. These were laid across trench tops like crude beams. On top, soil, mud, or even sandbags were piled to anchor the roof. What had been an open ditch became a covered shelter, a dugout roof, strong enough to block snow, hold back rain, and even shield from shrapnel. The strength of this method was its dual purpose. A covered trench kept soldiers dry enough to sleep, but it also concealed their movements from enemy aircraft. The dark roof blended with the earth, turning trenches into invisible veins across the battlefield. In bitter winters like the Ardennes, soldiers reported that even a thin, corrugated sheet layered with mud made the difference between freezing through the night and waking with some warmth preserved. But there were limits. The weight of heavy snow sometimes collapsed weak roofs. Poorly placed logs trapped smoke inside, choking soldiers if small fires were lit for warmth. Still, these crude trench covers were a lifeline, turning exposed pits into habitable shelters. This technique, born of desperation, carried a simple truth: survival did not depend on luxury, but on resourcefulness. A broken warehouse roof, a stack of logs, and the will to adapt could mean the difference between shelter and exposure. Number 2. Sandbag plus mud dugouts. When icy winds cut across the front lines of World War II, open-air trenches quickly became unbearable. Soldiers needed more than shallow cover. They needed walls that could hold back the cold and the rain. The answer came in the form of sandbags combined with the oldest building material of all: mud. Dugouts were carved deeper into the earth, transforming narrow trenches into underground shelters. Their walls were lined with sandbags stacked tightly, one atop another, forming barriers against collapsing soil. But sandbags alone were not enough. To seal gaps and block the biting wind, soldiers smeared thick layers of mud and clay over the walls. When dried, this earthen coating hardened into insulation, keeping warmth trapped inside and dampness pushed away. Inside these dugouts, soldiers could finally breathe without shivering from the elements. A candle could burn without being snuffed out by the gusts above. Conversations could happen without lips trembling from the cold. Even a small brazier of coals, carefully managed, could last longer in the insulated chamber. The real genius of this system lay in its accessibility. Sandbags were standard issue, but when supply lines broke down, sacks were filled with anything available: rubble, soil, even old uniforms. Mud was everywhere, and though it was messy, it became a crucial ally. Once applied, it turned a vulnerable pit into a more stable and weather-resistant shelter. Still, the design had its flaws. Heavy rain sometimes softened the mud too much, causing walls to sag or collapse. In flood-prone areas, water seeped upward from the ground, making the floor as wet as the walls were dry. Soldiers often laid planks or duckboards across the floor to keep themselves above the rising damp. Even with its weaknesses, the dugout was a triumph of necessity. With just sacks of soil and handfuls of mud, soldiers turned bare earth into a refuge that held back the winter's worst. It proved that even the simplest materials, when used wisely, could shield men from the relentless assault of weather. Number 3. Poncho lean-tos and shelter halves. On the march, soldiers rarely had the luxury of permanent dugouts or covered trenches. Rain could strike without warning, soaking uniforms and supplies, while mud swallowed boots with every step. In such moments, survival hinged on one of the simplest tools every soldier carried: the poncho, or what armies often issued as shelter halves. Each soldier carried half of a canvas tent. Alone, it was just a sheet of waterproof cloth. But when two halves were buttoned or tied together, they formed a small shelter large enough for 2 men. Rifles, stuck butt first into the ground, became support poles. A few ropes stretched between trees or stakes pulled from the earth added strength. Within minutes, soldiers could create a lean-to roof that turned heavy rain into runoff and kept their packs, rifles, and bodies dry. The genius was in its speed. Soldiers on the move didn't have hours to construct dugouts. They needed something fast, portable, and reliable. A poncho thrown over a rope between 2 trees could become instant overhead cover. Multiple ponchos combined into a larger sheet provided shelter for small groups. In freezing rain or sleet, this often meant the difference between sleeping in mud or at least resting under dry cover. But these shelters were never perfect. A strong wind could rip them loose. Water sometimes pooled in folds of canvas, threatening to collapse the roof. And insulation was non-existent. The poncho blocked rain, but not the cold air sweeping beneath it. To compensate, soldiers often layered branches or straw beneath the lean-to, keeping themselves off the wet ground and trapping a bit more warmth. Despite its flaws, the poncho lean-to was an indispensable hack. It represented mobility. Soldiers could strike camp in minutes, carry their cover on their backs, and never depend on fixed supplies. In environments where storms struck without warning, the poncho was both shield and roof, proof that survival in war came from simplicity as much as strength. If all you had was canvas and rope, could you build your roof in minutes? Subscribe now and discover more survival methods forged in history's harshest storms. Number 4. Snow, quinzhees, and foxholes. When the harshest winters of World War II closed in, snow itself became both the threat and the solution. Soldiers found themselves buried in blizzards where open trenches froze solid and wooden roofs cracked under the weight of ice. In these conditions, one of the most unlikely allies turned out to be the snowdrift itself. Soldiers learned that snow, when packed and shaped correctly, acted as insulation. By digging into large drifts or piling snow into mounds and then hollowing them out, they created what resembled small igloos or quinzhees. Inside, the temperature rose dramatically compared to the frozen air outside. Wind was blocked entirely, and body heat began to circulate in the confined space. A single candle could add precious degrees, turning unbearable cold into something survivable. Foxholes, too, adapted to winter's brutality. Dug deeper and lined with packed snow, they became natural shelters. Soldiers often reinforced their snow foxholes with branches, tarps, or spare boards to prevent collapse. In forests, Evergreen boughs laid across the entrance formed a crude roof that kept fresh snow from sealing them in. At night, when winds howled across open ground, these foxholes provided silence and stillness, a place to breathe and endure until morning. The strength of snow shelters was their availability. No supply chain was needed. No tools beyond a shovel or even a helmet were required. In the Battle of the Bulge, some soldiers recalled that without snow caves, frostbite and exposure would have claimed far more men than enemy fire. The snow that covered the land became the very shield against its deadly cold. Yet these shelters were fragile. Too thin a wall and freezing air rushed through. Too thick a roof and lack of ventilation suffocated those inside. A wrong movement could collapse the ceiling entirely. Discipline and careful construction were essential. Still, the snow quinzhee and foxhole proved a timeless lesson. Survival often comes not from resisting nature, but from using it. The very element that threatened to freeze soldiers into silence became the barrier that kept them alive. Number 5. Log-covered bunkers. Revetments. On the frozen fronts of World War II, soldiers quickly realized that shallow trenches were not enough. Snow piled too high, rain seeped too deep, and artillery shattered anything left exposed. The solution was to dig deeper and then build upward with the only resource always within reach: timber. Trees were felled, stripped, and cut into lengths that became beams across dugout roofs. These logs formed the skeleton of what came to be known as revetments, underground bunkers reinforced by wood, then buried under soil. Once covered, the structure blended seamlessly into the landscape. From above, it appeared as nothing more than another mound of earth or snow. From within, it became a shield against storms, wind, and enemy shells. The brilliance of log-covered bunkers was in their layered defense. Logs provided strength, soil gave insulation, and snow or mud piled over the top offered camouflage. Even in freezing nights, the thick, earthen covering trapped warmth. Small fires or stoves, carefully vented, could burn without the smoke giving away positions. Entire squads sometimes crammed into these shelters, their breath clouding the air, grateful for even a few degrees of warmth above the bitter outside. But the labor was punishing. Cutting logs with limited tools took time and strength already stretched thin. Collapses were a constant risk if beams weren't placed properly, or if too much weight pressed down from snow. Ventilation was another challenge. Poorly designed bunkers could choke their own occupants when fires consumed oxygen. Despite these dangers, log-covered bunkers became the backbone of survival in wooded regions of the eastern and western fronts. They allowed men to outlast blizzards, endure shelling, and stay hidden from aerial scouts. Many accounts describe soldiers stepping from these bunkers into knee-deep snowstorms, alive, only because of the timber roof above them. The lesson endures. When modern comforts vanish, strength lies in the earth and what grows from it. With nothing more than logs, soil, and ingenuity, men turned frozen ground into walls and forests into fortresses. Number 6. Stone and rubble windbreaks. In ruined towns and shattered villages of World War II, soldiers often fought in landscapes stripped bare of trees and stripped clean of supplies. Wood for fires or bunkers was scarce, but another material lay in abundance: rubble. Collapsed walls, broken bricks, and scattered stones littered the ground, useless to civilians, but priceless to men who needed shelter. Wind was one of the most punishing enemies in exposed terrain. Freezing gusts cut through uniforms, carrying rain and sleet sideways until every corner of a trench was soaked. Soldiers learned to stack rubble into low walls, creating crude windbreaks that turned the storm aside. Even a barrier, only waist-high, made a dramatic difference, shielding fire pits from being extinguished and allowing men to huddle in relative calm. Where bricks were plentiful, these walls grew sturdier. Stones were fitted together, mud packed into the gaps to block drafts. Sometimes doors from ruined houses were leaned against the walls, forming angled roofs that shed water. In places where whole buildings had collapsed, entire corners of rooms were repurposed as improvised shelters. A destroyed home might no longer protect its owners, but it could still guard soldiers from the elements. The brilliance of rubble windbreaks was their speed. Soldiers could build them in minutes, without tools, lifting only what the battlefield had already provided. They offered protection, not just from weather, but from enemy sightlines. A wall of stones could break the outline of a soldier's position as effectively as it broke the wind. Yet, like every wartime hack, limits remained. These walls were brittle under artillery, dangerous if poorly stacked, and weak against snowstorms that piled high and toppled them. Still, even in their fragility, they served a purpose. They proved that no scrap of the environment was wasted. Survival meant seeing value in the broken and the abandoned. For countless men, huddling behind a wall of bricks taken from a bombed-out house, it was not comfort they felt, but relief. Relief that the storm had been held back, if only for one more night. Number 7. Camouflage net overhangs. On the battlefields of World War II, survival meant more than staying warm or dry. It also meant staying unseen. Soldiers were forced to fight not only the cold and rain, but also the constant watch of enemy aircraft. A campfire, a trench, or even a movement in the open could invite disaster. The solution came through an ingenious blend of concealment and shelter. The camouflage net overhang. Standard issue camouflage nets were originally designed to hide equipment and vehicles from aerial view, but soldiers soon realized these nets could be repurposed into weather shields. Stretched across foxholes or shallow dugouts, they created a canopy that disrupted visibility from above, while also catching falling snow and rain before it reached the ground below. To strengthen them, nets were coated with mud, foliage, and branches pulled from the surrounding terrain. This not only enhanced camouflage, but added density, turning a thin mesh into a makeshift roof. When layered properly, the net blocked sleet, softened wind, and allowed men beneath it to rest in relative dryness. In forests, nets tied between trees became invisible ceilings, blending seamlessly with the canopy. The strength of these shelters lay in their dual function. They shielded soldiers from the elements while keeping positions hidden from enemy patrols and aircraft. A single overhang could mean the difference between detection and safety, between a night of shivering rain or a night of uneasy rest under cover. But they carried risks. Too much weight from wet snow could collapse the net, pulling down branches and revealing the position. Rain pooled in low spots, dripping steadily if not carefully arranged. And though they offered concealment, they provided little insulation. The cold still pressed through the night. Yet, despite their weaknesses, camouflage net overhangs embodied the wartime spirit of adaptation. What was designed as a tool of deception became a shield against both weather and enemy eyes. Soldiers proved that survival often depends on reimagining tools for new purposes, bending necessity into opportunity. For those who crouched beneath these nets in the silence of night, listening to rain patter harmlessly above, there was one thought: unseen, untouched, still alive. Number 8. Raised wooden duckboards and platforms. In the mud-soaked battlefields of World War II, the ground itself became an enemy. Constant rain turned trenches into swamps. Boots sank ankle-deep, uniforms stayed wet for days, and disease spread quickly in the stagnant water. Soldiers discovered that if they wanted to endure, they had to rise above the ground. The answer came in the form of wooden duckboards and improvised raised platforms. Duckboards were simple planks of wood laid side by side across the bottom of trenches. By lifting men even a few inches above the muck, they created a dry walking path. Boots that would otherwise rot from endless moisture lasted longer. Soldiers who might have collapsed in knee-deep sludge instead found footing, able to move without being swallowed by mud. But duckboards were more than just walkways. Soldiers quickly learned to raise sleeping areas as well. Spare planks, doors scavenged from ruined houses, and even crates were lashed together into makeshift platforms. These kept bedrolls and packs off the wet ground, protecting them from rot. At night, instead of lying in damp soil, men rested on crude wooden bunks that stayed far drier, conserving their strength for the battles ahead. The genius of duckboards lay in their practicality. They required no engineering, only scrap timber and a few nails or ropes. In places where wood was scarce, even branches woven together served the same purpose. A trench lined with duckboards transformed from a sucking swamp into something closer to livable ground. Still, there were limitations. Wood warped and rotted quickly in constant damp. Planks had to be replaced often, and when boards shifted, they created gaps that trapped ankles or broke under weight. In freezing weather, ice coated the boards, turning them into slick hazards. Yet, despite these flaws, the difference they made was undeniable. These raised platforms embodied the soldiers' constant fight not just against the enemy, but against the environment itself. In a war where mud claimed as much endurance as bullets, the ability to stand, walk, and sleep above the ground was not a luxury. It was survival. The shelters of World War II were never meant to impress. They were crude, improvised, and built in desperation. Yet each one carried a truth we have nearly forgotten. Survival depends less on comfort and more on ingenuity. A trench covered in broken timber, a dugout sealed with mud, a poncho strung between rifles, a bunker carved from logs and earth. These were not conveniences. They were lifelines. In snow, rain, and endless mud, they kept men alive when nothing else could. And what's striking is how ordinary the materials were. Wood, soil, stone, canvas, the very things lying around us even today. We have grown used to central heating, electric stoves, and sturdy homes. But history reminds us that systems can fail, storms can overwhelm, and comfort can vanish overnight. When that day comes, survival will again belong to those who can see shelter in rubble, warmth in snow, and safety in nothing more than earth and wood. That is why remembering these lessons matters, not as relics of the past, but as tools for the future. If you believe this wisdom should never be lost, then take action now. Subscribe, because every story we uncover brings back knowledge that once meant survival. Stay with us, and together we will rebuild the resilience our grandparents lived by.